Hello, my name is Leander. I'm presenting on the Palestinian Liberation Movement for the People's History 2, Fall 2023. So here's to start us off with a quote. Where is Palestine? Right, Palestine is on the east of the Mediterranean. Its capital is Jerusalem. It's got a population of around 5.5 million people, and agriculture is one of the largest sectors of the economy. As such, with population growth, there is rapid urbanization, most notably in the Gaza Strip, as well as loss of land and loss of life, as well as poverty. A significant portion of the population, specifically in the Gaza Strip, lives in refugee camps, and it's a very small area. The West Bank is a much larger area, but there is a lot of segregation. We see here specifically the rise of Israeli settlements that literally take lands that was once Palestinians and give it to Israelis for cheap housing. And this comes with like segregated roads as well as checkpoints and borders to control the movements of Palestinians. So here's a very brief timeline of the history of the state of Palestine. In World War I, the British allied with Arabs to fight the Ottomans for the land. The Arabs thought that they were going to get a sovereign state. They didn't. The British promised it to the Jews with the Balfour Declaration. This was very unpopular with the Arabs. In fact, the British had to station more troops in Palestine during this time than they had in all of India just to attempt to control the population. This problem was then passed on to the UN, which published the Partition Plan of 1947, which was going to create the two-state solution. Also very unpopular, as Jewish settlers were about a third of the population, but they were going to get 50% of the land, and most notably some of the best farmland. Arabs didn't like it, but the Zionist militias launched attacks on Palestinian villages in 1948, which was called the Nakba, which is Arab for catastrophe, displacing thousands, killing hundreds, if not thousands. And then fast forwarding 20 years, there was the Six-Day War, where a coalition of Arab states fought against Israel, largely over the treatment of Arabs in Palestine. It didn't last very long, and the Arab states lost. Fast forwarding another 20 years, there was the first Intifada, which was a popular Palestinian uprising in civil context. It was mostly peaceful demonstrations, but there were violent actions taken. After this, there was the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, which was a peace process between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. It ultimately failed, and not long after, there was the second Intifada in 2000. So loss of life and land are the most significant things in Palestine, right? The growth of Israeli settlements, as I mentioned in the West Bank, Palestinians are literally seeing their land taken from them by the Israeli government. The loss of life in terms of the conflict, from injuries and deaths just in 2008 to 2020, a very narrow window. We can see that there's like a 22-to-1 ratio in this conflict where the Palestinians are overwhelmingly suffering more losses, more injuries, and they're generally just in more poverty. So they are under very dire living conditions. As such, they resent Israel. As such, they rebel, they revolt, are killed, injured, or imprisoned, and the cycle just keeps on continuing. Who governs Palestine? So the Palestinian Authority, also known as Fatah, governs the West Bank. They were founded in 1959, and they really were dominant after the Six Days War due to the guerrilla actions they took against Israel. But they now control the West Bank in partnership with Israel, which is not very popular with a lot of Palestinians. Hamas, on the other hand, controls the West Bank, and they were elected in 2000, controls the Gaza Strip, and they were elected in 2006. And they largely rule in opposition to Israel. They were designated as a terrorist organization, and they still are across most of the West. But this is where most of the rocket attacks are launched from against Israel. So, what do the people actually think? Here's a quote from Ahmed Namir. She's a Palestinian anarchist, and Yasser Darbour, the president of the Palestinian American League. Please pause and take a second to actually read these quotes. And another quote here from Norar Erakat, excuse my pronunciation. She's a professor, she's an associate professor at Rutgers University, specifically talking about the media situation. Again, please pause the video to read the quote. And then lastly, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, this is a really popular slogan from the 1960s. Sorry, my mic turned off. Anyways, so what are some of the political and philosophical views? So, what does freedom for Palestine look like? It looks like the end of segregation, the end of the military courts, land reform and redistribution, freedom of movement for Palestinians, and the replacement of the ethno-religious state of Israel with a democratic or secular one in which all citizens have equal rights under the law, because the current two-state solution is separate but equal states, which are in practice very unequal. And some of the philosophical views are like decolonialism and anti-imperialism, as well as Islamist, communist, and anarchist elements of the movement. There is a lot written about these, but it's beyond the scope of this brief presentation. So what are some opposition to the freedom for Palestine? Um, A common one is that the idea of from the river to the sea is calling for the genocide of Jewish people. I don't believe that statement is true, but this is very popular, especially as we saw with the censoring of the US Congresswoman, as well as the idea that releasing thousands of Palestinian prisoners is just not feasible. This was one of the large reasons that Hamas took hostages or captives on October 7th, is to barter for the release of Palestinians. But it gets to a deeper conversation about the military court system and the disparities in the criminal prosecuting, as well as the like evidence required for trial. So I definitely oppose this as well. I think the like overwhelming imprisonment of Palestinians for their actions against Israel, because it seems like violent offenders are about like 1% of the prisoners, is just kind of leading to more disparity in Palestine. Moving on, another point is that ending the war, that Israel declared war on Hamas, which has been the first time since the Six Days War, would like mean a victory for Hamas. Like it would seem like they won if Israel backed down from this current conflict. Um, I think this is a very dangerous idea because if Israel, who is doing the vast majority of the killing via airstrikes, doesn't stop, then the conflict is just going to continue to grow and the casualties are just going to worsen. And it seems then that Israel's only solution for peace would be the genocide of the Palestinians, which I think is the worst idea. But I support a ceasefire. You know who else supports a ceasefire? Most of the world. Here we can see UN member nations, 153 of them voted in favor. Um, 23 abstained and 10 voted against. But like the most significant vote against is the United States over there on the far right, as one of the members of the UN Security, one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So the US, China, and Russia, our votes hold a lot of weight. And despite 13 of the 15 Security Council member nations voting for a ceasefire, the US's vote against it says no ceasefire. So I think the US significantly needs to change how we want to handle this conflict. Here we can see international support for Palestine over on the right. All these green nations recognize the sovereignty of Palestine. Whereas on the left, all the blue nations donated military aid to Ukraine. And you can see a very clear like division between the global north and the global south, or the west, between which conflicts are just, right? When the Russians invade Ukraine, oh, that's a just cause, we should help them. But when Hamas or the Palestinians attempt to break off from Israel, that's not a just cause. We shouldn't help them. We should support Israel and donate billions of dollars in weapons. But we can see that a lot of these nations that recognize the sovereignty of Palestine are actually former colonies. And this kind of gets to the larger like decolonialist and anti-imperialist philosophy that I mentioned in a slide earlier, a few slides earlier. A lot of these nations sympathize with Palestine because they see the settler colonialism that Israel is using against them, and they have been subject to it, and some of them in living memory, right? Most of Africa didn't achieve independence until the 60s. So it's very clear that we have a wedge growing between these two sectors of the globe internationally. And I think Palestine will continue to be like a wedge issue between the haves and the have-nots around the globe. And unless Israel and significantly the US are willing to acknowledge that our solutions are not producing a better, safer world, this disparity is going to continue to grow, as well as support against the US and the law. Anyways, I'm at my time for this presentation, but I want to thank you all for listening. Here are my sources, and here's my ending slide and the credits for this presentation. Have a nice day. Goodbye.